In the municipality of La Union Isidoro Montes de Oca, nestled deep within Mexico's Guerrero region, a horrifying scene plays out. Two men, a father and presumably his son, lie on the cold ground, their hands bound tightly behind their backs. The father screams as his captors beat him without mercy, before issuing a chilling warning. His entire family will experience a similar fate. Then, one of the men takes out a knife, its blade glinting in the light. He presses it to the father's throat, slowly drawing blood, while the boy is forced to watch every agonizing momenta. And that's only the start. There's a lot more to come as we reveal the shocking extremes of cartel violence in today's episode of the Infographic Show, Most Brutal Torture Methods by Mexican Cartels, Part 2. Number 10. Guerrero Flaying. Flaying, a gruesome process where the skin is painstakingly removed from the body, is among the cartel's most excruciating methods of torture. With precise control over the initial cuts, the victim's agony can be prolonged for hours, even days, as they bleed out slowly. This was the horrifying punishment that a father and son faced in 2018, and their ordeal recorded on video for the world to see. The perpetrators were allegedly linked to the infamous Sinaloa Cartel, a shadowy empire built on violence, fear, and loyalty. Known for their ruthless enforcement of power, the cartel operates with an iron fist, leaving no room for betrayal. In this case, the victim's past connections with the cartel sealed their grim fate. The father was referred to as a grasshopper, a derogatory term for a cartel member who provides information to an opposing cartel or law enforcement. The father had admitted to snitching to another cartel, and the interrogator then spoke directly to the camera, announcing what would happen to every snitch that the cartel finds. The father was severely beaten, something that started before the cartel began filming. Then one member starts cutting the man's throat. The man suffers an agonizing death, all while his son is forced to watch, while trying to back away from his father's death. After that, it's the boy's turn. The executioner repeatedly hits the boy, who is gagged and screaming. Tears stream down his face as he is forced onto his father's lifeless body. What follows is an unimaginable act of cruelty, designed not just to punish, but to send a gruesome message. The executioner takes a knife, targeting the boy's limbs to prolong his suffering rather than end his life. It is clear this nightmare is far from over. Then the flaying begins again. The executioner methodically cuts into the boy's chest, his screams filled with agony as cartel members hold him down. One enforcer presses a rifle against the boy's forehead, ensuring compliance. Yet the cuts are shallow, calculated to avoid fatal blood loss. The boy drifts in and out of consciousness, overwhelmed by the sheer shock and torment. The executioner begins stripping muscles from his ribs, inflicting unimaginable pain. The torture doesn't end there. It culminates in the mutilation of the boy's body and the removal of his organs. The brutality ends with the cartel claiming that this will be the so-called gift that they have for snitches and the opposition. Flaying is primarily meant to send a message, just like this next method. Number 9. Group Murder. In 2014, the disappearance of 43 male students in the Guerrero region prompted nationwide demonstrations. The students had traveled to the area to protest discriminatory hiring practices in government offices. According to the student union, the students hitchhiked to the protest, but various news reports stated that over 100 students were aboard 3 buses being driven to the protest, with plans to return. On the return trip, the vehicles were stopped by local police, who at some point opened fire on the vehicles. Panicked students ran for cover or were killed on the spot. Others were taken into custody, at least according to official police reports. The police then handed the students in custody over to the Guerreros Unidos, an offshoot of the Beltran Leyva cartel. Out of the 43 students who disappeared, presumably all in the cartel's custody at that point, only 3 bodies were ever recovered. The first was a 22-year-old student found the day after the kidnapping. The autopsy revealed he had been beaten severely with over 64 bone fractures across his face, skull, and spine. The student's body showed signs of flaying, but the authorities suggested that thankfully this gruesome act was performed post-mortem. However, investigators also suggested that the flaying may have been caused by animals, possibly the exotic pets kept by prominent cartel members, including lions and tigers. The theory would mean the student was brutally beaten to death before his body was left as prey. While no one has ever found the bodies of the remaining students, all of them were likely killed relatively shortly after being transferred over to the cartel. The leading theory points to the protest they were planning as a potential threat to delicate negotiations. These negotiations allegedly involved the local mayor's wife and other influential figures in the region, individuals suspected of working closely with the cartel. By silencing the students, the cartel could protect their allies and maintain their grip on local power structures. Cartels are also known to use buses to transport and smuggle drugs, so buses moving across the region might have been interpreted as actions by an opposing cartel, which could have prompted the attack. The students who were tortured and killed met that fate by entering cartel territory by mistake. But what happens to people who are intentionally targeted for information? Number 8. Waterboarding. The answer might lie with someone on the other side of the torture fence, a man who once made disappearing people his grim profession for the cartel. This assassin, who likes to portray himself as a humble cattle farmer, admits to occasionally handling cartel targets. The disappearing in this case is shorthand for kidnapping, information extraction, torture, execution, and disposal of the body in a place where it won't be found. The man stated that what he does is purely because the cartels often have more influence in the region than the law enforcement. In the absence of police, one cartel effectively provides protection against the others. The killer said that he preferred 3 particular methods for torturing, all with the goal of getting information the cartel needs from the victim. The first method is brutal, yet timeless: beatings. Though simple, they remain devastatingly effective in breaking both body and spirit. The second method, waterboarding, is a form of psychological and physical torment that goes beyond cartel violence, with a history of use spanning centuries across the globe. We'll discuss the third method in a moment. At its core, waterboarding is a brutal yet bloodless torture method. The victim is tied face up on a board with a thin cloth or towel covering their nose and mouth. The torturer pours a small amount of water over the cloth, which prevents the passage of air. Almost immediately, the victim's gag reflex tries to activate and expel the water, which is ineffective if they're immobilized. Then the water starts drowning the victim. To extend the torture, water is poured intermittently, with the victim allowed short periods of breathing before waterboarding resumes. A single session of torture typically lasts for 20 minutes, involving repeated cycles of pouring water to simulate drowning. The victim is usually allowed brief moments to gasp for air, but the process is usually repeated 3 or 4 times. However, if torture persists, the water causes lung damage and oxygen deprivation. Even if the victim doesn't die from drowning, they could be left with severe brain damage. Previously, waterboarding was thought to only simulate drowning by intermittent water exposure. This was later proven false, as the effect is identical to being drowned in a large body of water, with all the potential side effects and deadliness. Number 7. Electroshock torture. The third method that the anonymous disappearer used was electric shock. The South American picana is perhaps the most recognizable electroshock torture implement. The picana is derived from cattle prods, and it uses a high-voltage, low-current shock. This means that it's less likely to kill the victim, but still inflicts severe nerve damage and burns to the surrounding area. It's particularly effective as a torture method. The cartels have adapted the picana by repurposing uninsulated wiring to deliver jolts of electricity with similar properties. For a simpler approach, police tasers are sometimes used, requiring fewer modifications to achieve a comparable effect. In either case, the result is the same: a searing jolt of pain concentrated on a small area of the body. To increase the torment, victims are often doused with water. It allows the current to penetrate deeper and spread further from the source, intensifying the pain and increasing the psychological toll. The Mexican disappearer said that the shocks were typically given to the soles of the feet, the testicles or the genitals, and the tongue. The genitals and the tongue have more nerve endings than other parts of the body on average, which only amplifies the painful effect of the torture. By focusing on the soles, the victim would be unable to stand or walk afterward. The disappearer, a cattle farmer by trade, has no formal military or intelligence training, nor was he ever instructed in the art of torture. Yet, despite his lack of professional expertise, he claims to have killed at least 30 people. He said he learned which torture methods work best solely via personal experience and hands-on training. But perhaps even more effective methods of torture are psychological rather than physical ones, of which the cartel has utilized a few different types. Number 6. Gladiatorial combat. One of the most notable cases of mass murder and torture occurred in 2010 when a Mexican cartel abducted men from passenger buses for seemingly no apparent reason. Law enforcement found at least 193 bodies across 48 mass graves a year later. Most of the bodies were found to have blunt force injuries, believed to be from a sledgehammer. The deaths are suspected to be connected to the Zetas drug cartel, considered to be the most brutal cartel when it comes to killing. Authorities believe that the Zetas abducted the men and gave them a seemingly simple choice: work for the Zeta Cartel or die. Those who accepted the work offer would likely be folded into the cartel's operation for their entire lives. Those who refused were likely given sledgehammers and ordered to fight each other. It's unknown what happened to the victor of the makeshift gladiatorial arena, as there is no winning when you go against the entire cartel. The men could have been promised their lives back if they killed the others, which only added to the emotional trauma they could experience. Most likely, the entire event was used as a show of force to the new members that the cartel obtained during the kidnappings. Whether someone managed to score a kill with a sledgehammer over another unsuspecting victim likely didn't matter, as the winner was probably executed shortly after. A similar situation happened much more recently in 2023, when a group of 5 students was kidnapped by a cartel. A video that circulated at the same time showed a cartel group tossing a brick to someone later identified to be one of the kidnapped students. The video contained an image with the text "Puro MZ" over it, allegedly a reference to the former Sinaloa cartel boss El Mayo Zambada. The video showed some of the students bound, gagged, and apparently put on display. The brick handler seems to have been forced to maim and injure his friends in various ways, including with the brick. Before the remains of the 4 students were discovered, a body was found in a burned-out vehicle. It was never confirmed that the burned body was indeed the 5th student, but it is highly likely. But as we've seen earlier, brutality isn't limited to students. Cartels aren't above torturing and executing families, no matter the age of the members. Number 5. Axing. After ordering a series of brutal killings, Marciano Chano Milan Vasquez, the former regional leader of the Los Zetas cartel, was finally captured in 2015. Witnesses to Vasquez's crimes corroborated that he was responsible for at least 18 deaths, but 3 of those were particularly brutal. By some accounts, Vasquez took a family of 3 hostage. Presumably, the father was the actual target of Vasquez's brutality, likely due to his being affiliated with other cartels or failing to obey Zeta's orders. After kidnapping the family, Vasquez's men sat the father down and held his head by the hair, so he would be forced to keep his eyes open to watch what was about to happen to the rest of his family. Vasquez then took an axe and started attacking the man's family. According to the witnesses, this was all done so the father would remember Vasquez. Then the father himself suffered the same fate. Their body parts were later burned and dispersed, so they couldn't be found by law enforcement. The extent of Vasquez's and the Zetas' brutality didn't stop there, of course. Other witnesses corroborated that dismemberment was likely the cartel leader's favored modus operandi when it came to killing, with at least 4 other victims dying the same way. The witnesses at Vasquez's trial were also victims, as they were either blindfolded and held prisoner for ransom or forced to watch the brutal deaths of those around them. In truth, there is no reason for why some of the cartel leaders behave the way they do. They hold the reins of power, so they use it as they see fit. It doesn't matter if their victims, like the many families that were killed over the decades, are related to cartel activities. In essence, they are merely a means to an end for cartel leadership, to send a clear message of what various cartel members would do to their opposition. Number 4. Cannibalism. In the corporate world, ruthless CEOs sometimes have a saying, "Eat or be eaten." On some occasions, the cartels take that literally. Yes, we are referring to actual cannibalism. Even cartel members in good standing are sometimes forced to take part in this ritual by their leadership. The first of such allegations of cannibalism centered around the CJNG cartel, among the most brutal offshoots of the Milenio cartel. To insulate their men against outside interference, cartel leadership devised strategies to make them more hardened to the stress of being in the organization. But it was also to promote loyalty to leadership. This led to an unprecedented tactic that would become an open secret across the country. The CJNG didn't just stop at kidnapping, torturing, and murdering their victims. They wanted to put the cartel members above the rest of the people, making them more than humans. So the victims would be used as training grounds for members being promoted into the cartel. First, the prospective members would be trained on the most effective and brutal methods of hacking away digits, fingers or toes, or entire limbs. And then the trainees were told to eat the severed digits to earn the approval of the leaders. When they became desensitized to eating fingers, they would move on to larger body parts until they became fully accepting of eating human flesh. However, the consequence of failing to eat human flesh was severe. If anyone vomited, the instructors would retrieve the half-digested fingers and shove them back into the trainees' mouths to repeat the process. The dehumanizing training didn't stop at eating bodies either. Recruits were also forced to live and sleep next to corpses, an extreme tactic meant to drill into them that they weren't like the rest of humanity anymore. This brutal months-long process was all about breaking down their empathy and self-identity. Living so close to death meant that they would essentially become shells of their former selves and become slaves to the cartel leadership. Not to be outdone, Miguel Trevino Z40 Morales, the ruthless leader of the Zetas, reportedly took things to another level. The Drug Enforcement Agency claims he personally killed over 500 people and even ate the hearts of his victims, believing it would make him invincible against his enemies. In most cases, Morales would use knives, bats, or even hangings to execute his enemies. He would force cartel members to either be observers or even take part in the process, with Morales' men being witness to brutal, lengthy, often innovative methods of torture. They would be more likely to stay in line and not even attempt to double-cross the organization. Number 3. It's all in the legs. Miguel Z40 Morales was one of the few regular users of the stew method for killing and disposing of bodies. But as with many cartel leaders, there's even more brutality to this man. In one case, Morales found out that one of his hitmen was dating an 18-year-old girl who was also dating a Mexican soldier. Morales kidnapped both the girl and her mother with plans to execute them. The crime? The girl's relationship with a soldier might mean that she could be sending information about the cartel. Morales first killed the mother with a submachine gun while the girl was forced to watch. The girl was in so much pain at this point, she was begging to be killed. When she could no longer stand up, she was executed. Number 2. Death by dog. In 2019, a man reportedly in his 30s allegedly attacked and assaulted a woman. Whether he was actually convicted by the local law enforcement was unclear. What was clear, however, is that the local drug gang, which was likely part of a larger cartel, wanted to exact its own revenge as soon as possible. A few gang members attacked the man and filmed the entire process for the rest of the world to see. The man was handcuffed so he couldn't run or fight back. Then, the gang pinned him to the ground with the same bats they used to maul him. And then came the dogs. The gang unleashed one of their pit bulls to inflict a frenzied attack, while the victim pleaded for mercy. The video was uploaded shortly after, presumably as a warning to other men who might be considering the same crime. It's unclear what happened to the man in the videos, as there are no reports of whether he was found by the authorities or taken to a hospital. It's likely that the gang just left the man to die somewhere or executed him to end the supposed message. Number 1. Police brutality. In some cases, the actual police might be as bad as the cartels themselves. In fact, many officers are part of the cartels. So how could Mexicans trust their law enforcement system when the cartels, for better or worse, are likely a significant part of it? While the police have been fighting the cartels for years, not everyone on the force plays by the book. Some officers have been known to bend the rules, pinning crimes on innocent people if it suits their agenda, especially when it helps the cartel. This blurred line between law enforcement and organized crime has led to cartel-style torture methods creeping into police practices themselves. As we mentioned earlier, police are suspected of being involved in the disappearance and the assassination of 43 students in 2014. Meanwhile, in 2021, Mexican authorities arrested former federal police commander Luis Cardenas Palomino on charges of being involved with the torture and kidnapping of a suspect in 2012. The connection to the cartels? Well, Cardenas Palomino is believed to have taken bribes in the millions of dollars from the infamous Sinaloa cartel and its one-time leader, the infamous Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. We're talking about the federal police commander here, so it is clear the connection between law enforcement and the cartels runs pretty deep. That's not the only evidence of a substantial cartel presence in the police force. In June 2005, the Mexican government suspended the entire police force of Nuevo Laredo for corruption and their close involvement with drug cartels. Eventually, of the 765 officers on the force, 305 were fired, 41 were fired for attacking federal officers when they arrived to replace them. Police doing the dirty work for cartels doesn't just stop at flexing their muscle over mere civilians. In August 2010, even the mayor of Santiago fell victim. Alone at home while his wife and children were in Texas, Edelmiro Cavazos answered his door only to be greeted by armed assailants and a fleet of cars. Cavazos was shoved into one of the vehicles, whisked away, and later found dead by the side of the road. He became one of 14 mayors who were killed that year alone. So how did cartel gunmen get so close to the mayor of a tourist town like Santiago? Easy, with the help of local police who not only allowed the gunmen to approach but greeted them as they arrived. They basically opened the door and let the cartel inside. In all, 6 officers were involved in the abduction and killing. The cartels use brutal torture methods as a way to build up their reputation. It keeps their members, opponents, and bystanders in line. When faced with working for and around the cartels or death or torture, most people would inevitably choose the former option. This keeps the cartels growing and unchecked, and even lets them publicize their acts for future generations and maintain their legacy. It might be tough to think about, but what torture method do you think would be the worst to endure? Leave a comment down below. Now go check out insane torture methods you won't believe were actually used, or click on this video instead.